When I discovered my husband had given away my family heirloom ring to his sister without even asking me, I was furious. But when he told me to stop overreacting because it was just jewelry, I decided not to argue. Instead, I kept quiet, waiting for the perfect moment. Little did his sister know, when she tried to sell the ring, she'd be in for the shock of her life. It all began on what should have been a perfectly uneventful evening. I had just finished tidying up the bedroom and decided to retrieve my family heirloom ring from the jewelry box. It wasn't something I wore often. In fact, I reserved it for only the most special occasions. The ring wasn't just beautiful, it carried the weight of generations. My grandmother had passed it down to my mother, who had passed it down to me on my 21st birthday. To say it was priceless would be an understatement. But when I opened the jewelry box, it wasn't there. At first, I told myself to stay calm. Maybe I'd moved it to another spot for safekeeping. I started a careful search, going through every drawer in my vanity, every cabinet in the room, and even checking the hidden corners of my closet. As the minutes ticked by, my calm demeanor cracked. I began frantically pulling open random drawers, checking coat pockets, and even rummaging through handbags I hadn't used in months. The ring was nowhere to be found. My heart began to race as panic set in. The thought of losing something so irreplaceable was unbearable. I sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to think back to the last time I'd worn it. Was it at that dinner party a few weeks ago? No. I'd taken it off after that. Had I misplaced it somewhere else in the house? It seemed unlikely. I was meticulous about keeping it safe. By the time my husband came home, I was on the verge of tears. "Hey," he said, stepping into the room. "What's wrong?" I stood up and faced him, holding back the flood of emotions. "Have you seen my ring?" I asked, my voice trembling. The heirloom ring. My grandmother's ring? For a moment, he looked caught off guard. Then, as if realizing he couldn't feign ignorance, he let out a nervous chuckle and avoided my gaze. "Oh, that ring," he said, scratching the back of his neck. I stared at him, my stomach twisting into a knot. "Yes, that ring. What about it?" "Well," he began, his voice trailing off. "I gave it to my sister last week. She mentioned she really liked it, and I thought it'd be a nice gesture." Time seemed to stop. I blinked, hoping I'd misheard him. "You gave it to your sisters?" I repeated slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. "Yeah, she's been having a tough time lately, and she said she loved the ring. So I figured, why not? It's just jewelry." My breath caught in my throat. "It's not just jewelry," I said, my voice rising. "It's a family heirloom. It's been in my family for generations. How could you give it away without even asking me?" He shrugged, still avoiding my eyes. "I didn't think it was a big deal. I mean, you barely wear it. I thought you wouldn't mind." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My hands were trembling as I tried to process his casual dismissal of something so deeply important to me. "You thought I wouldn't mind?" I said, my voice shaking. "Do you even realize what you've done? That ring isn't just a piece of jewelry. It's a part of my family's history." He held up his hands defensively. Okay, I get it. I didn't think it through. But it's not the end of the world. I'll talk to her and get it back if it's that important to you." "It is that important," I snapped. "And you shouldn't have given it away in the first place." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind was racing with anger, frustration, and disbelief. How could he be so thoughtless? And what was his sister thinking, accepting a ring like that without questioning it? As much as I wanted to storm over to her house and demand the ring back, I knew I needed to approach this carefully. I didn't want to escalate the situation or cause a family feud, at least not yet. Instead, I decided to wait and see how my husband would handle it. But deep down, I already suspected this was going to be far more complicated than he realized. After all, if she loved the ring enough to accept it in the first place, I doubted she'd give it back willingly. And if that turned out to be the case, I was prepared to do whatever it took to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The moment my husband said the words, "It's just jewelry," I felt my blood pressure spike. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, and I stared at him, trying to process how someone could be so flippant about something so important. "You what?" I finally managed to say, my voice trembling with disbelief. "I gave it to my sister," he repeated, his tone casual, as if he were explaining where the missing loaf of bread had gone. "She's family." "I thought it was fine." "You thought it was fine?" I said, my voice rising. "That ring is a family heirloom, not something you can just hand over like a box of chocolates. It's not yours to give away. She's going through a hard time, he said defensively, folding his arms across his chest. And she really liked the ring. I figured it'd cheer her up. I don't see why you're making such a big deal out of this. My jaw dropped. You don't see why I'm upset? I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. That ring has been in my family for generations. My grandmother wore it at her wedding. My mother passed it down to me. It's not just a ring, it's a piece of my family's history. He rolled his eyes, a move so dismissive it made my chest tighten. I get that it's sentimental, but it's not like you wear it all the time. Honestly, I thought it was just sitting in your jewelry box gathering dust. His words felt like a slap in the face. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. Just because I don't wear it every day doesn't mean it's not important to me, I said, my tone sharper than I intended. Do you have any idea how much that ring means to me? Or to my family's? He shrugged. I'm sorry if it upset you, but I really didn't think it was a big deal. It's just a piece of jewelry. Stop calling it just jewelry, I snapped. You have no idea what you've done. And the fact that you didn't even ask me, I stopped myself, realizing I was teetering on the edge of yelling. I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly, trying to calm down. You should have talked to me first. That's all I'm saying. He sighed, clearly tired of the conversation. Look, if it's such a problem, I'll talk to her and see if she'll give it back. But honestly, I think you're overreacting. Overreacting. The word echoed in my mind, each syllable stoking the fire of my anger. But instead of lashing out, I forced myself to stay calm. We'll talk about this later, I said, turning away before I said something I couldn't take back. For the rest of the evening, I avoided him. I needed space to cool down and think about my next move. I couldn't stop replaying his words in my head. It's just jewelry. Don't overreact. Each time, the phrase cut deeper. How could he be so dismissive of something so important to me? I texted my best friend, Emily, to vent. She knew how much the ring meant to me and immediately replied with a series of angry emojis. He did what? She wrote. That's not okay. You need to get it back. I know, I replied, staring at the screen. But how do I even approach this? His sister probably thinks it's hers now. And if she loves it as much as he says, I doubt she's going to give it back willingly. Emily's reply came almost instantly. It doesn't matter what she thinks, it's yours. She had no right to take it, and he had no right to give it to her. You need to get it back no matter what. She was right, of course. But the thought of confronting my sister-in-law filled me with dread. She wasn't exactly the most reasonable person, and I could already picture her digging in her heels if I demanded the ring's return. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. It wasn't just about the ring. It was about the fact that my husband hadn't even considered how I might feel before giving it away. It was like my feelings, my connection to the ring, hadn't mattered to him at all. I knew I needed to act, but I also knew this situation required careful handling. If I went in guns blazing, it would only escalate the tension. And while I was furious at my husband, I also didn't want to create a permanent rift between us or within the family. The next day, I resolved to start with a conversation. I needed to talk to his sister directly and find out what she thought of the situation. But deep down, I already suspected this was going to be far more complicated than I hoped. Because if there was one thing I knew about my sister-in-law, it was this. Once she had her hands on something she wanted, she wasn't likely to give it up without a fight. The morning after my heated conversation with my husband, I woke up with a singular goal. I needed to get to the bottom of this. If his sister already knew the ring was a family heirloom, then this was a deeper betrayal than I'd thought. My anger simmered as I dialed her number, each ring of the phone tightening the knot in my stomach. Hello, her chipper voice greeted me. Hi, I said, trying to keep my tone steady. It's me. I want to talk to you about the ring. Oh, the ring, she said, her voice lighting up. Isn't it gorgeous? I couldn't believe he gave it to me. It's so unique. I haven't taken it off since he gave it to me. I clenched my jaw. You know it's a family heirloom, right? It's been in my family for generations. My grandmother wore that ring at her wedding. There was a pause, but instead of the apology I was hoping for, she said, well, he told me it was fine. He said you didn't wear it much, and I thought it'd be better off with someone who could really appreciate it. I took a deep breath, trying to tamp down the fury rising in my chest. It wasn't his to give away, I said, my voice firm. That ring means a lot to me and my family. I need it back. Her tone changed instantly, going from cheerful to defensive. I don't see why I should have to give it back, she said. Your husband gave it to me as a gift. If it was such a big deal, maybe you should have told him to keep it locked up or something. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It wasn't locked up because I never thought anyone would take it without asking me, I shot back. And you can't just keep something that's not yours, especially when you know how much it means to me. Well, it's mine now, she said sharply. And honestly, I think you're overreacting. It's just a ring. There it was again, just a ring. The same dismissive attitude that had driven me up the wall when my husband said it was now coming from her. It's not just a ring to me, I said, my voice trembling with frustration. It's a piece of my family's history. You have no right to keep it. Like I said, she replied, her tone dripping with condescension. Your husband said it was fine. If you have an issue, maybe you should take it up with him. Her words were like pouring gasoline on a fire. I wanted to yell, to tell her exactly how selfish and entitled she was being, but I knew that wouldn't get me anywhere. I'm asking you, as a favor, to return it, I said, my tone calmer than I felt. I'm trying to handle this respectfully. And I'm telling you, she snapped, that I love the ring and I'm not giving it back. End of story. Before I could respond, she hung up on me. I sat there, staring at the phone in disbelief. My mind was racing with anger, frustration, and a sinking feeling that this situation was spiraling out of control. She knew exactly what the ring meant to me, and she still refused to return it. Worse, she had the audacity to act like I was the one causing a problem. That evening, I told my husband about the call. She said she's not giving it back, I said flatly. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'll talk to her, he said. But you really shouldn't have called her in the first place. It's just making things more complicated. More complicated? I repeated, my voice incredulous. You're the one who made it complicated by giving away something that wasn't yours to give. I said I'd handle it, he replied, his tone defensive. You need to trust me. But I didn't trust him. Not with this. I knew his sister, and I knew she wasn't going to give up the ring without a fight. And while my husband might have good intentions, he clearly didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. That night, I lay awake, replaying the conversation with his sister over and over in my head. Her smug tone, her dismissive attitude, the way she'd brushed off my feelings, it all fueled my determination. This wasn't just about the ring anymore. It was about respect. My husband and his sister had both disregarded my feelings, and I was done being polite. If they thought I was going to let this go, they were sorely mistaken. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to get that ring back. And if that meant making a few waves, so be it. After my heated conversations with both my husband and his sister, I knew one thing for certain. Arguing wasn't going to solve anything. His sister was too stubborn, and my husband was too passive. If I kept pushing, it would only escalate into an all-out family feud, something I desperately wanted to avoid. Instead, I decided to take a step back and think strategically. I couldn't control their actions, but I could control mine. And if his sister thought she'd won, she was wrong. I just needed to be smarter about how I approached the situation. As I mulled over my options, an idea began to take shape. My sister-in-law had a reputation for being impulsive with money. Over the years, she'd pawned or sold countless items that she'd been gifted, everything from expensive handbags to pieces of jewelry. She was the type who valued the thrill of something new more than the sentiment behind it. If she held onto my ring, it wouldn't be because of its emotional value. It would be because of its perceived worth. And knowing her, I figured it was only a matter of time before she tried to sell it, especially if she needed quick cash. That's when it hit me. I could use this to my advantage. I spent the next evening doing some research. I made a list of every pawnshop, jewelry store, and antique dealer in the area. Then I started calling each one, explaining the situation. Hi, I'm reaching out about a stolen family heirloom, I'd say, my tone calm but firm. It's a vintage ring, very distinctive. White gold with a sapphire center stone, surrounded by smaller diamonds. If anyone tries to sell or pawn it, could you please give me a call? Most of the shop owners were understanding, and a few even jotted down my contact information. Some asked for proof, so I emailed them photos of the ring, along with a written description. I didn't share all the details, I didn't want to give away too much, but I made sure they'd recognize the ring if they saw it. I also learned a few things during those calls. For one, most pawnshops require sellers to show identification, which meant there'd be a paper trail if the ring turned up. And while some shop owners seemed skeptical, others assured me they'd be on the lookout. It was tedious work, but it gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in weeks. I wasn't just sitting around waiting for my husband or his sister to make a move. I was actively protecting my heirloom. After a couple of days, I felt confident that I'd covered all my bases. If my sister-in-law tried to sell the ring locally, I'd hear about it. But I didn't stop there. Knowing my sister-in-law's love for social media, I started keeping an eye on her accounts. She was the type to post pictures of her latest finds or humble brag about her life, and I figured she might slip up and share something about the ring. Sure enough, a few days later, she posted a photo of her hand, adored with my ring, along with the caption, "When your brother knows your taste is impeccable." Feeling spoiled. The sight of my ring on her finger made my stomach turn, but I resisted the urge to comment. Instead, I saved the post as evidence. If this turned into a legal battle, I'd need all the proof I could get. In the meantime, I avoided any direct confrontations with my husband or his sister. I pretended everything was fine, even though my anger simmered just beneath the surface. My husband, oblivious to my plan, probably thought I'd let the whole thing go. But I wasn't letting anything go. I was biding my time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The hardest part was the waiting. Every day, I wondered if the ring would turn up at one of the pawn shops or if my sister-in-law would decide to keep it for good. I hated feeling so powerless, but I reminded myself that this was a long game. Little did I know, my patience would pay off sooner than I expected, because just a few weeks later, I got a phone call that changed everything. The days turned into weeks, and the waiting began to weigh on me. Every time I thought about the ring, my grandmother's ring, sitting on my sister-in-law's finger or, worse, in some pawnshop display case, my stomach churned. It wasn't just the loss of a beautiful piece of jewelry, it was the principle of it, the blatant disregard for something so meaningful to me and my family. Outwardly, I kept my composure. I acted as if the situation no longer bothered me, especially around my husband. "You don't seem upset anymore," he said one evening while we were watching TV. I shrugged, forcing a small smile. "It's not worth the stress," I lied. "What's done is done." If he suspected that I was lying, he didn't let on. Maybe he was relieved, thinking I'd moved on, and decided not to escalate the issue further. I didn't care. Let him believe I was over it if it meant I could carry out my plan without interference. I avoided discussing the ring with anyone, not even my closest friends. It wasn't that I didn't trust them, but the fewer people who knew about my plan, the better. I didn't want word getting back to my sister-in-law and tipping her off. This was a delicate situation, and I couldn't afford for anything to go wrong. Every day, I checked my phone obsessively, hoping for a call from one of the pawn shops or jewelers I'd contacted. But as the days dragged on without any updates, doubt began to creep in. What if she wasn't planning to sell the ring? What if she decided to keep it forever? That thought filled me with dread. I pictured her wearing it to family gatherings, flaunting it in front of me as if it were rightfully hers. The idea of seeing my grandmother's cherished ring turned into a trophy for her vanity was almost too much to bear. Still, I held on to hope. My sister-in-law wasn't the sentimental type, and her financial habits were anything but stable. If she needed cash, and she always seemed to need cash, it was only a matter of time before she tried to pawn the ring. Then, one afternoon, just as I was beginning to lose faith, my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed the name of a pawn shop I'd reached out to weeks earlier. My heart leapt as I answered. "Hello. Hi, is this your name?" a man's voice asked. "Yes, this is she," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "This is Ron from Ron's Pawn and Jewelry," he said. "A woman just came in with a ring that matches the description you gave us, a sapphire with a diamond halo, white gold band. She's trying to sell it right now." My heart pounded in my chest. "Are you sure it's the same ring?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "Pretty sure," he said. "It looks exactly like the photo you sent. I can stall her if you want to come down and check." "Yes, please," I said quickly. "I'll be there as soon as I can." As soon as I hung up, I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door. My mind raced as I drove across town, alternating between anger and relief. I couldn't believe she'd actually tried to sell the ring, and so brazenly too. But more than anything, I felt a renewed sense of determination. This was my chance to set things right. When I arrived at the pawn shop, my hands were shaking as I pushed open the door. My eyes scanned the room, and there she was, my sister-in-law, standing at the counter, chatting casually with the clerk. She hadn't noticed me yet, which gave me a moment to collect myself. On the counter in front of her, sitting on a small velvet pad, was the ring. My ring. I took a deep breath, steadied my nerves, and walked up to the counter. "Hello, Lisa," I said, my voice calm but cold. She turned to me, her eyes widening in surprise. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone defensive. "I could ask you the same thing," I said, glancing pointedly at the ring. "But I think we both know the answer." Her face flushed and she stammered. I just thought I'd see what it was worth. It's not like I was really going to sell it." I crossed my arms. "Really? Because it sure looks like you were about to sell it." The pawn shop clerk cleared his throat. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between the two of us. "There is," I said firmly. "That ring is a family heirloom, and it doesn't belong to her. It was taken without my permission." What followed was a tense and awkward standoff. My sister-in-law tried to argue that my husband had given her the ring as a gift, which technically made it hers. But I wasn't backing down. "I have proof that it's an heirloom," I said, pulling out my phone and showing the clerk photos of me wearing the ring at various family events. "This ring has been in my family for generations. It was never my husband's to give away." The clerk looked uncomfortable, but eventually nodded. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said to my sister-in-law. "I can't buy this ring from you. You'll have to settle this elsewhere." Her face turned bright red, and she snatched the ring off the counter.
"Fine," she snapped.
"If it's such a big deal, take it." She shoved the ring into my hand and stormed out of the shop without another word. As the door slammed shut behind her, I stood there, clutching the ring tightly. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with exhaustion and anger. The battle wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. But for now, I had the ring back where it belonged. The drive to the pawn shop felt like the longest 15 minutes of my life. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and my mind raced with every possible scenario. Would she deny everything? Would she make a scene? Would I be able to get the ring back without this turning into a full-blown disaster? When I pulled into the parking lot, I sat in the car for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. I couldn't afford to lose my composure, not when I was this close to reclaiming what was rightfully mine. As I walked into the shop, the little bell above the door jingled, and my eyes immediately locked onto her. There she was, standing at the counter, chatting casually with the clerk as if she didn't have a care in the world. The sight of her made my stomach twist, but what really caught my attention was the ring sitting on a small velvet pad in front of her. There was no mistaking it. The distinctive sapphire, the intricate diamond halo, the white gold band. It was my grandmother's ring. I squared my shoulders and approached the counter, my heels clicking loudly on the tile floor. "Hi, Lisa," I said, my voice calm but icy. She turned to face me, and for a moment, her expression was one of shock. Her face went pale, and she stammered, "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," I replied, keeping my voice steady. I reached out and picked up the ring, holding it in my hand like it was a piece of treasure I'd just unearthed. "This is mine, and you know it." Her jaw tightened, and I could see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to come up with an explanation. "Your husband gave it to me," she said, her tone defensive. "It was a gift." "No," I said firmly, my gaze locked on hers. "It was never his to give. This ring is a family heirloom, and you know that." She let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, come on. It's just a ring. Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" My hands clenched into fists at my sides, but I forced myself to stay calm. "It's not just a ring," I said. "It's been in my family for generations. My grandmother wore this at her wedding. My mother passed it down to me. And you think you can waltz in here and sell it like it's some random trinket?" The pawnshop clerk, who had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, finally spoke up. Is there a problem here?" "Yes," I said, turning to him. "This ring belongs to me. She took it without my permission and is trying to sell it." "Hey," my sister-in-law snapped. "That's not true. Her husband gave it to me. It's mine now." I turned back to her, my patience wearing thin. "You can argue all you want, but I have proof," I said, pulling out my phone. I opened the gallery and showed the clerk photos of me wearing the ring at various family events. "This is my ring. It's been in my family for decades." The clerk studied the photos, then glanced at my sister-in-law. "Do you have any proof that it belongs to you?" he asked her. She hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "Well, no," she admitted. "But her husband gave it to me as a gift. That should be enough." "It's not," the clerk said, shaking his head. "I can't complete this transaction if there's a dispute over ownership." "I'm sorry, but you'll need to sort this out elsewhere." My sister-in-law's face turned bright red, and I could see the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. You can't just take my word for it. No, I can't, the clerk said firmly. I don't want any legal trouble, and this clearly isn't as straightforward as you made it seem. She turned back to me, her eyes blazing.
Fine, she spat.
If it's such a big deal, take your stupid ring. She snatched it off the counter and shoved it into my hand with so much force I almost dropped it. I held the ring tightly, relief washing over me. Thank you, I said, my voice steady. She grabbed her purse and stormed out of the shop, the door slamming shut behind her. The clerk let out a low whistle. Well, that was something, he said, shaking his head. Glad I didn't get caught in the middle of that. Thank you for calling me, I said, slipping the ring back into its velvet box. You have no idea how much this means to me. He smiled. Just doing my job. I hope everything works out for you. As I walked out of the shop, clutching the ring tightly in my hand, I felt a sense of triumph I hadn't felt in weeks. The battle wasn't over. Not entirely. There was still the matter of dealing with my husband and the fallout from this confrontation. But for now, the ring was back where it belonged. And I wasn't about to let it out of my sight again. The pawnshop's tiny room felt like it had expanded as my sister-in-law turned to face me, her expression a mix of indignation and panic. She clearly hadn't anticipated being caught, and now that she was, her defensiveness shot up like a shield. You have no right to barge in here like this, she snapped, her tone dripping with condescension. Your husband gave me this ring. It was a gift, and I can do whatever I want with it. I tightened my grip on the counter, keeping my composure. It wasn't his to give, I said firmly. You knew it was a family heirloom. You knew how much it meant to me. And yet here we are. She scoffed, crossing her arms. If it meant so much to you, maybe you should have told him to keep it locked away. How is it my fault he gave it to me? I didn't ask for it. The pawnshop clerk cleared his throat, glancing between us with growing unease. Ladies, I really can't have this kind of dispute in here. I cut him off, my tone apologetic but resolute. I understand, but this isn't just any piece of jewelry. This is a family heirloom, and I can prove it. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, scrolling quickly to a folder of photos. I handed the phone to the clerk, who studied the images intently. There I was, wearing the ring at my college graduation, at family weddings, and at a holiday dinner with my grandmother. This ring has been in my family for generations, I explained. It's not something you can buy or sell. It carries more sentimental value than I can put into words. My sister-in-law rolled her eyes. Oh, please, she said. So you wore it a few times. That doesn't mean you own it. Your husband gave it to me, and that makes it mine. The clerk raised an eyebrow at her. Do you have any documentation to prove it's yours? He asked. She hesitated, clearly caught off guard. Well, no, but... Then I'm sorry, he said, shaking his head. I can't complete this transaction. I'm not about to buy something that might be stolen. You'll need to sort this out somewhere else. Her face flushed an angry shade of red. This is ridiculous, she snapped. You're taking her side without even knowing the full story. I've seen enough, the clerk said, crossing his arms. Now, I think it's best if you both leave. I don't want any trouble here. I turned to my sister-in-law, my voice firm but calm. You heard him. This ring doesn't belong to you, and you know it. Hand it over. Her jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought she might refuse. But then she let out an exasperated sigh, grabbed the ring from the counter, and shoved it into my hand with more force than necessary. Fine, she snapped, grabbing her purse.
Take it.
I don't need it anyway. I held the ring tightly, relief and satisfaction washing over me as she stormed out of the shop, muttering something under her breath. The bell above the door jingled loudly as it slammed shut behind her. The clerk let out a low whistle. Well, that was something, he said, shaking his head. I smiled faintly, slipping the ring back into its velvet box. Thank you for your help, I said. I'm sorry for the scene. No worries, he replied. I'm just glad it didn't escalate. Good luck with all of that. As I walked back to my car, clutching the ring tightly, I felt a sense of victory I hadn't experienced in weeks. The ring was finally back where it belonged, safe in my possession. But as the adrenaline began to fade, I realized this wasn't the end of the story. My sister-in-law's reaction told me she wasn't going to let this go quietly. And then there was my husband. How would he react when he found out what had happened? Part of me wanted to be satisfied with the outcome and move on, but deep down, I knew there were still conversations to be had, boundaries to be set, and trust to be rebuilt. For now, though, I allowed myself a moment of peace. I slipped the ring onto my finger, feeling its familiar weight, and vowed to never let it out of my sight again. Little did I know, the fallout from this confrontation was only just beginning. The drive home from the pawnshop was filled with a strange mix of relief and simmering anger. On one hand, I finally had my grandmother's ring back where it belonged. On the other, I couldn't shake the frustration of how close I'd come to losing it forever, all because of my husband's careless decision. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, staring down at the ring in my hand. Its sapphire glinted in the fading sunlight, a stark reminder of the battle I'd just fought to reclaim it. My anger, which I'd managed to keep in check at the pawnshop, bubbled to the surface again. I took a deep breath, tucked the ring safely into its box, and walked into the house, ready for the confrontation I knew was inevitable. My husband was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, completely oblivious to the storm about to hit. "Hey," he said without looking up. "How was your day?" I held up the ring, its familiar shape now a symbol of the chaos he'd caused. "Do you have any idea what your sister just tried to do?" I demanded. He looked up, his expression shifting from casual to confused. "What are you talking about?" "She tried to sell it," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "She walked into a pawnshop with this, and tried to sell it like it was hers. If I hadn't been watching for it, it would be gone right now." He stared at the ring in disbelief. "She tried to sell it?" "Yes," I said, my anger boiling over. "And if I hadn't stepped in, it would be gone forever. This isn't just jewelry, and you had no right to give it away in the first place." He leaned back on the couch, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't think she'd actually do something like that," he said, his tone defensive. "That's the problem." I shot back. "You didn't think. You didn't think about what the ring meant to me, or how your sister might treat it, or how I'd feel when I found out it was gone." He sighed heavily, looking genuinely torn. "I thought it would make her happy. She's been going through a rough time, and I thought it wasn't a big deal. You barely wear it." I felt a fresh wave of frustration at his words. "It doesn't matter how often I wear it," I said. "It's not about that. This ring isn't just a piece of jewelry, it's a piece of my family's history. My grandmother wore this on her wedding day. My mother passed it down to me. And you gave it away like it was nothing." For a moment, he didn't say anything. His eyes were fixed on the ring, and I could see the guilt starting to settle in. "I didn't realize how much it meant to you," he admitted quietly. I let out a bitter laugh. "How could you not? I've told you about this ring a dozen times. You were there when my mom gave it to me. You know how important it is." "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I messed up." "Yes, you did," I said, my tone softening slightly, but still firm. "And your sister made it worse. She acted like I was the one being unreasonable, like I didn't have the right to ask for it back. Do you realize how humiliating it was to have to chase her down at a pawnshop to get my own ring back?" He looked up at me, his eyes filled with regret.
"I'll talk to her," he said.
"I'll make sure she knows she was out of line." "You should have done that weeks ago," I said, crossing my arms. "But this isn't just about her. This is about us. You can't make decisions like that without talking to me first. This ring is important to me, but so is trust. And right now, I don't feel like I can trust you to respect my boundaries." His face fell, and I could see the weight of my words sinking in. "I know I messed up," he said. "And I know it's going to take time to fix this. But I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." I wanted to believe him, but the hurt was still fresh. "I hope you mean that," I said. "Because this can't happen again. Not with the ring, not with anything else. I need to know that you respect me enough to value the things I care about." He nodded, his expression earnest. "I do respect you. And I'm sorry I didn't show that. I'll make this right, I promise." I sat down next to him, holding the ring tightly in my hand. "I'm keeping this somewhere safe," I said. "And from now on, we need to be on the same page about things like this. No more surprises." "Agreed," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. That night, as I placed the ring back in its box and tucked it away in a secure drawer, I felt a mix of emotions, relief, exhaustion, and a lingering sadness that things had come to this. My husband's apology felt genuine, but I knew it would take time for me to fully trust him again. And as for his sister, I doubted this was the last time we'd clash over boundaries. But for now, I had the ring back where it belonged, and that was a victory I wasn't going to take for granted. That night, after the tension of the day settled but my frustration still simmered beneath the surface, I knew we couldn't avoid the conversation any longer. The ring was back in my possession, but the damage went far beyond its temporary absence. What I needed now wasn't just an apology. I needed clarity, understanding, and, most importantly, boundaries. As we sat down in the living room, the silence between us was heavy. My husband looked exhausted, like he wanted nothing more than to move past this, but I wasn't about to let that happen without addressing what had gone wrong. "We need to talk," I began, my voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about the ring. It's about trust and respect. Two things I feel were completely disregarded when you gave it away." He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "I've already said I'm sorry," he said. "What else do you want me to do?" "I don't want just an apology," I replied, my tone sharpening. "I want to understand why you thought it was okay to give something so important to me away, without even asking." "I told you," he said defensively. "I thought it would make her happy. She was going through a rough time, and I didn't think you'd miss it." "That's the problem," I said, leaning forward. "You didn't think. You didn't consider how I might feel, or what that ring represents to me. You treated it like it was just another piece of jewelry, when it's so much more than that." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said softly. "I didn't realize how much it meant to you." "You should have," I said, my voice rising slightly. "This isn't the first time I've talked about how important that ring is to me. You've heard the stories about my grandmother, and how she passed it down my mom. You were there when my mom gave it to me. How could you not realize how much it meant?" He didn't respond immediately, and the silence stretched between us. Finally, he said, "You're right. I should have known. And I should have talked to you first. I messed up." I nodded, acknowledging his admission, but I wasn't ready to let it go. "This isn't just about the ring," I said. "It's about boundaries. I need to know that you respect me enough to ask before making decisions that affect me, especially when it comes to something so personal." He looked at me, his expression conflicted. "I do respect you," he said. I don't know. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was trying to help my sister, and I didn't think it through." "I understand wanting to help your sister," I said, my tone softening slightly. "But helping her shouldn't come at the expense of disrespecting me. You could have talked to me first. We could have found another way to help her. Instead, you made a decision that hurt me and created this mess." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "You're right," he said again. "I should have handled it differently." For the first time, it felt like he was truly hearing me. I decided to press forward. "We need to set some boundaries," I said. "Not just with each other, but with your sister, too. She needs to understand that there are limits to what she can ask of you, and what you can give." "What kind of boundaries?" he asked cautiously. "For starters," I said, "no more giving away things that aren't yours to give. If something belongs to me, you ask me first, no exceptions. And when it comes to your sister, she needs to understand that she can't manipulate you into making decisions that hurt our relationship." He winced at the word manipulate, but he didn't argue.
"I'll talk to her," he said.
"I'll make it clear that what she did was wrong."
"And?"
I prompted, raising an eyebrow. "And I'll make sure she knows there are limits," he said reluctantly. I nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. "Good," I said, "because this can't happen again. The ring is back where it belongs, but the trust we've lost isn't going to be so easy to fix." "I know," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to rebuild that trust." For the first time that evening, I felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still lingering tensions, and I wasn't sure how things would play out with his sister, but it was a step in the right direction. That night, as I placed the ring back in its box and tucked it away in a secure drawer, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes, but also a sense of caution. The ring was safe, but the underlying issues in our marriage were far from resolved. Still, I held on to the hope that this was the beginning of a better understanding between us, a foundation on which we could rebuild the trust that had been shaken. I wasn't naive enough to think it would be easy, but for the first time, I believed it was possible. The aftermath of the ring debacle was quieter than I expected, but it left an undeniable ripple through my life. On the surface, things returned to normal. The ring was back where it belonged, tucked safely in its velvet box, and the house once again felt like my sanctuary. But beneath that calm exterior, there were fractures, small cracks in my relationships with my husband and his family that I wasn't sure would ever fully heal. My husband tried his best to move forward. He apologized again, more sincerely this time, and made an effort to show that he'd learned from the situation. For weeks, he walked on eggshells around me, careful not to push any buttons or make any decisions without consulting me first. While I appreciated his effort, the underlying tension lingered, a reminder of the trust we still needed to rebuild. As for my sister-in-law, she avoided me entirely. At family gatherings, she barely acknowledged my presence, her icy demeanor making it clear that she felt like the victim in all this. I didn't mind the distance. If anything, it was a relief not to have to deal with her manipulative energy. But her silence didn't feel like an olive branch. It felt like a cold war. Despite the strained relationships, I couldn't bring myself to regret how I'd handled things. The ring was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a piece of my identity, a tangible link to my family's history. Losing it, even temporarily, had forced me to confront not only my husband's lack of consideration, but also my own hesitance to stand up for myself. For years, I'd prided myself on being easygoing, the kind of person who avoided drama and went with the flow. But this incident taught me that there's a difference between being easygoing and being a pushover. By staying quiet, by trying to keep the peace, I'd let people walk all over me. Not just my sister-in-law, but my husband as well. The moment I decided to fight for that ring, something shifted. I realized that I had a voice, and I had every right to use it, especially when it came to things that mattered deeply to me. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about asserting my worth and demanding the respect I deserved. A few months passed, and just as I was beginning to feel like the storm had blown over, I got an email from my sister-in-law. Seeing her name in my inbox sent a wave of annoyance through me, but curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. The email was short and to the point. Hi, my name. I hope you're doing well. I was wondering if you'd consider letting me borrow the ring for an upcoming event. It would really mean a lot to me, and I promise to take great care of it. Thanks, Lisa. I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. After everything that had happened, the arguments, the pawnshop showdown, the weeks of tension, she had the audacity to ask me to borrow the ring? There was no apology in her email, no acknowledgement of how her actions had caused so much turmoil. It was as if she decided to erase the past and start fresh, without any effort to take responsibility. I didn't bother replying. Some people just don't learn, and I wasn't about to waste my time trying to teach her. In the months that followed, I thought about the incident often, not with anger, but with a sense of clarity. It had been a painful experience, yes, but it had also been a catalyst for change. It forced me to reevaluate my relationships and set boundaries I should have established long ago. My marriage was stronger now, not because we'd brushed things under the rug, but because we'd faced the issue head-on. My husband and I had learned how to communicate more honestly, and he'd come to understand the importance of respecting my feelings and my family's history. As for my sister-in-law, I didn't hold out hope for any real change. But that was okay. I didn't need her validation, and I certainly didn't need her approval. All I needed was the knowledge that I'd stood up for myself and reclaimed what was mine. Now, whenever I look at the ring, it feels even more special than before. It's not just a reminder of my grandmother or my family's legacy. It's a symbol of my own strength, of the moment I chose to fight for something I believed in. In the end, I got the ring back. But more importantly, I got a piece of myself back, the part of me that knows my worth and isn't afraid to demand the respect I deserve.